You all for coming. I hope that this afternoon will be a pleasant respite for us. I'm sure I'm not the only one who wants to think about something else, or as I told our panelists, or who isn't eager to have her mind bent and bent around something other than the grimness of the world. Anyway, my name is Judy Coffin, and along with my colleague and friend Sally Charno, we co-host French Presse, which is a sort of monthly series on new books, conversations about new books, and some that have been around for a while. I am delighted this afternoon to have Sara Black and Hannah Friedman focusing on Sara's new book, Drugging France, Mind-Altering Medicine in the Long 19th Century. I should also note that French Presse is sponsored by French Historical Studies, and the FHS conference is coming up at Hofstra in Long Island, where I was born, between March 14th and March 16th. Sally, has the call for papers closed, or is it still open?
I would say that it has closed, but we're flexible.
Right.
Very flexible.
That is often the case with these things. When one looks behind the curtain, one realizes that you can really get in your proposals a little bit later, especially if you come up with something good last minute. Anyway, housekeeping notes for this afternoon's event. We've kept your videos off, and we have muted everyone except the speakers, and we've disabled the chat until the discussion opens for Q&A. At that point, the chat is open for questions, for comments, for interventions, as our colleagues in French say, and please send them through the chat to Hannah, although obviously if you send them to somebody else, they'll eventually get routed to Hannah. Anyway, now I'm going to pass it over to my friend Sally, who is going to introduce Hannah, and Hannah will then introduce Sara. Okay, take it away.
Thank you so much, Judy. It's a great pleasure to introduce Hannah Friedman, who is an assistant professor of French studies at the University of Washington. They are a specialist in the cultural history of modern France, and especially interested in labor, capitalism, media, reading, gender, sexuality, and the racial politics of reproduction. Their article, as I think everyone in the room knows, Freedom's Sex Problem, Classified Advertising Law and the Politics of Reading in Third Republic France, has now won 2 prizes, New York Association of European Historians and the Malcolm Bowie Prize from the Society of French Studies. So congratulations on that, first of all. They are also currently finishing a book entitled Between the Sheets, Classified Advertising, Sexuality, and the Moral Threat to the Free Press in France. This work reconstructs the history of quote-unquote immoral classified advertising in the Parisian press during the French Third Republic to show how sexual and gender classified advertising opened up new possibilities to live, non-normative lives, and also inspired state and social efforts to exercise close control over both non-normative bodies and new media in the name of Republican morality. So such fascinating work. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to pass it to you.
Thanks so much, Sally. Well, I get probably the most distinct pleasure of introducing Sara Black. Sara is a historian of medicine in modern France. her first book that we're all here to talk about, Drugging France, Mind-Altering Medicine in the Long 19th Century, which was published in 2022, which she'll be presenting to us. Recently won the J. Russell Major Prize in French History from the American Historical Association. Huge congrats to Sara. As assistant professor of history at Christopher Newport University, she teaches courses on medical history, French history, global history, and the history of gender and sexuality. Her research interests include urban history, hygiene and public health, gender and sexuality, and criminality. Her work on the history of drugs has appeared in Social History of Medicine, French Historical Studies, and the Oxford Handbook of Global Drug History. And her next book project, which sounds really interesting, explores the history of transnational public health campaigns against tuberculosis during and after the First World War. So edging toward the 20th century, it sounds like. Before turning the mic over to Sara, I just wanted to say, Sara, that I'm really honored that you asked me to be your interlocutor today. Yours was one of the first dissertation defenses that I ever remember going to as a grad student. So there's something really special about being here to celebrate this really amazing book that dissertation became, and to celebrate its prizes, its prize, and to be here to help you welcome it into the world, and whet everybody's appetite to read it. So I will hand the mic over to you now.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah, for coming to my dissertation defense and for agreeing to read the book and come and talk about it today. I really appreciate it. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you all so much for having me. Thank you to Sally and Judy for organizing the event. And a special thanks to Hannah for reading the book. I know it's a bit long, so I appreciate that. So I wanted to provide a quick framing and overview of the book, and then go on to talk about some of the key themes, but I want to try and keep it brief so we have plenty of time for questions afterwards. So my book focuses on the history of drugs in France, and specifically my research focuses on what are known as psychotropic drugs, that is to say, drugs that act on the mind and the body to alter an individual's perceptions of pain, states of consciousness, modify sensation, etc. So I focus on 6 of these drugs in particular: opium and morphine. Morphine is the alkaloid of opium. Chloroform and ether, which are both anesthetic gases, and cocaine, which is another alkaloid of the coca plant, and hashish, which is a North African cannabis paste. Now, as a medical historian, I'm really interested in exploring how these new pharmaceutical remedies that were developed in the 19th century really changed people's lives in dramatic ways. So in modern society, swallowing the pill to treat pain, anxiety, or depression has become a really normal part of everyday life. In fact, it's one where people don't really reflect philosophically about this too much. They just take the pill and move on, because we've come to accept pharmaceutical solutions to these problems. Historically, however, the efficient management of pain was not really something that French citizens could take for granted. For millennia, pain was just an inevitable part of life. During the 19th century, however, new therapeutic practices and rituals of consumption fundamentally transformed the ways in which individuals experienced their own bodies. So if you had an aching tooth, you could soothe that with opium extract, or you could have it painlessly extracted with a few inhalations of chloroform. Pain, rather than being an inevitable burden, became an aspect of life over which people had a measure of control. So in the 19th century, I argue, France was a nation on drugs. A wide variety of new pharmaceuticals began to reach all corners of France and its empire in the 1840s, thanks to the isolation of new alkaloids and the industrialization of French pharmaceutical production. So in new hydraulic factories, pharmaceutical manufacturers like the Menier Company transformed raw opium imported from Turkish markets in Smyrna, modern-day Izmir, into pills, powders, salves, and tonics. So you have countless new products emerging for the management of pain. So much so that by 1888, a Frenchman from a small town in the Midi in southern France could complain that the use of these substances is kind of universal. It's everyone using and abusing them. So the enigmatic nature of the psychotropic power of these drugs remained remarkably versatile. So these drugs could be used in many different contexts. From the pharmacy counter to the boudoir, from the asylum to the courtroom, from the battlefield to the birthing chamber, psychotropic drugs kind of reconfigured how individuals perceived and experienced their own minds and bodies. So by examining the expansion and normalization of drug consumption in 19th century France and into the early 20th century, I chart what I like to call the emergence of France's psychotropic society, a society that was founded upon a new norm, the chemical enhancement of modern life. Now, in this society, individuals increasingly turn to psychotropic drugs to regulate their minds and their bodies. Now, typically, scholarship on the history of opiates, cocaine, and other drugs has tended to focus on issues of addiction, of deviance, and regulation. So the global war on drugs in the 20th century serves as the major frame of reference for this work. Now, historians of drugs have focused on explaining how the consumption of certain drugs came to be viewed and understood as illicit and deviant. However, this focus on the demonization of particular drugs obscures what I believe is a more interesting question, which is how did these drugs become such commonplace commodities in the first place, before they were demonized, before this became viewed as a social crisis? So my book takes on this question. Instead of viewing the history of drugs in the 19th century as an initial chapter in the history of drug regulation in the 20th, my work demonstrates that the 19th century was the foundational period in our own modern psychotropic society. The moment when citizens learned to expect and even demand pharmaceutical solutions to their pain. So instead of looking at addiction as the defining experience of drug use, I demonstrate the ways in which addiction was just a more extreme manifestation of an increasingly commonplace practice. So at its heart, my book is a history of normalization. It examines the process through which pharmaceutical management of the miseries and discomforts of modern life became possible, desirable, and eventually indispensable. Now, this new psychotropic society I'm describing did not emerge out of thin air. Its construction depended upon a vast community of knowledge producers. Anyone from scientists, agriculturalists, entrepreneurs, to doctors and pharmacists, who transformed exotic plant substances and mysterious volatile gases into comprehensible and consumable pharmaceutical commodities. From the laboratory tests of solitary chemists to fiery public debates in the French academies, there was immense scientific apparatus that produced the normalization of psychotropic drugs within the medical marketplace and then within French society more broadly. Now, one of the biggest challenges for doctors researching drugs in the 19th century was to figure out what the appropriate dose was, or exactly what effects these drugs would have over the mind and the body, what safe doses would be, etc. And so to do this, many doctors experimented on themselves, transforming their own bodies into experimental tools. So this self-experimentation provided crucial medical knowledge about the effects of these drugs. Yet it also exposed tensions between the subjectivity of the experimenter and his commitment to scientific objectivity. So through self-experimentation, doctors, pharmacists, and others developed new therapeutic knowledge about anesthetic drugs that revolutionized the experiences of childbirth and surgery, for example. And this transformed patients' expectations of pain and their feelings about medicine more broadly. They began to demand pain relief from their doctors as a fundamental right. So the ability to use drugs to control pain is one of the defining features of this emerging psychotropic society. And this was really empowering, not only for the patients who experience relief, but also for the doctors who prescribe these drugs and enhance their own authority and credibility as medical professionals in the process. However, despite all of this self-experimentation and research that doctors conducted, these drugs didn't always behave in the ways that they expected. Doctors positioned themselves as gatekeepers of these pain-relieving substances, claiming that under their supervision, patients could consume them safely. However, the widespread and unanticipated addiction that resulted from the overprescription of morphine in the second half of the 19th century really undermined those claims. Now, psychotropic drugs also catalyzed social, ethical, and philosophical debates. Medical investigations and discussions about psychotropic drugs served as platforms for grappling with pressing concerns about sexual mores and depopulation, selfhood, and the role of the individual within modern society. The widespread consumption and overconsumption of psychotropic drugs in the 19th century also caused people to question the very notion of individual free will that lay at the heart of French conceptions of political citizenship and judicial responsibility. So in theory, the consumption of psychotropic drugs enabled French citizens to master bodily pain and alter their consciousness at will. However, in practice, a lot of these psychotropic effects of the drugs over the individual's mind and body, illustrated most starkly in the case of addiction, really exposed the vital role that the body played in determining individual behavior. So, to take an example from the criminal courts, through medical legal debates over morphine addiction, doctors, lawyers, and medical experts had to grapple with complicated questions, like, for example, did a morphine addict have free will at the time when they're experiencing their state of withdrawal? Or should that same addict be held responsible for crimes committed in order to procure more supplies of morphine? So the issue of free will and the kind of free-willing liberal subject lay at the heart of the French legal system. Yet, because morphine had such a strong influence over the addicted body, experts determined that addicts in a state of withdrawal couldn't really be held fully responsible for their actions. Medical legal experts compared the addict to a starving man stealing bread. Rather than exercising his own free will, the addict in withdrawal was driven to steal in order to procure more morphine, satisfying his body's physiological need for the substance. So I examine this shifting power dynamic between the individual subject and the material object acting upon him to dictate his behavior. So the idea of a liberal subject who could think for himself was at the heart of French politics and, of course, a bedrock of French intellectual life. But drugs exposed the inherent instability of that notion. And they forced doctors, judges, lawyers, and others to grapple with the individual as an embodied subject and rethink just how much free will individuals actually had. So in writing the history of drugs in France, I explored an incredibly rich archive of medical and pharmaceutical texts. However, I recognize that the normalization of drug consumption in France did not come about solely in the pages of medical journals or in debates in the Academy of Sciences, but through countless acts of individual consumption that were sometimes grand and sometimes ephemeral, even desperate or mundane. So in order to map out the entangled medical and cultural histories of drugs in France, I had to read medical journals, police reports, and pharmacy catalogs against the grain to try and access the experiences of the asylum inmate, the society woman, the criminal defendant, or the laboring mother. Patients' own experiences of and knowledge of psychotropic drugs encouraged practices of self-medication and self-experimentation that didn't necessarily fit into doctors' medicalized vision of pain relief. Individuals sought out drugs on their own to treat ailments, to experience pleasure, and to produce altered states of consciousness. At the same time, doctors, pharmacists, and the state sought to mobilize these drugs to relieve pain in the hospital wards, to restore sanity in the asylums, and to shore up their own authority over the bodies of citizens. But nevertheless, psychotropic drugs frequently eluded efforts to try and harness their power toward a specific regulatory end. So Drugging France reframes the history of drugs and the making of modern society. It doesn't treat the history of drugs primarily as the rise of a social crisis, but instead it documents the production of a new biomedical norm. And it explores the history of drugs in the 19th century in France as a crucial step in the development of France's modern pharmaceutical economy. So rather than fixating on regulation, criminalization, and deviance, it demonstrates the ways in which psychotropic consumption really became an integral part of everyday life.
Great. I feel like I should clap for that. Thanks so much, Sarah, for really a wonderful presentation of the book. And for those of you that haven't yet gotten the chance to read it, I mean, I think that really does set up incredibly nicely the very many different ways that you take this. And I think that you, as you say, like you use a variety of archives in ways that, you know, to access the voice of people and not just kind of top down. I will just echo what Sally's saying in the chat. Send your questions to me. I get the privilege of asking a few, but then I will take your questions, comments, all of those things, and ask them on your behalf to Sarah. I think to start, and you've done this so well in your presentation already, but I think that you know, and there were so many things in the book that, you know, we're not going to have time to talk about all of them. I really did have a hard time kind of narrowing things down to choose because of the many different directions that the book goes in. that drugs play so many roles in so many different kind of areas of life, that, from medicine to politics to gender. We'll try and touch on at least some of the more important ones. But I thought that to start, it makes sense to kind of go straight to what I think you're already saying in your presentation is the heart of the book. That kind of drugging France is this history of normalization of drugs, not a history of deviance. And I was hoping that you could say a little bit more about why and how you came to choose this approach to drugs when you started out in this, well, maybe where did you start to get into this topic, if that's something you'd like to talk about, and also kind of why you find this lens to be particularly important, both for understanding kind of the past, the present, and how those two things kind of come together.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I really didn't expect the book to go in this direction. When I started out, I expected it to be a much more traditional history of drugs. So I've always had a kind of fascination with medical history, particularly pharmaceutical history and pharmacy museums. Actually, the apothecary shop in Colonial Williamsburg was one of the places that I loved to go when I was younger. I was just so fascinated by the rows of jars and thinking about how different people's lives would have been consuming these kinds of things all the time. So, I mean, the medical history has been an interest for a while, but I expected to find more kind of traditional drug history when I was beginning this project. So I began with literary texts. So looking at Théophile Gautier's 1843 short story on the Hashish Eaters Club, for example. So basically, this is a group of people, artists and intellectuals, painters, sculptors, etc., who get together on the Ile Saint-Louis in the 1840s, and they consume hashish, which they call the paste of paradise, right? And this kind of exoticized drug experience. And they're trying to experience bizarre hallucinations and trying to research the self. And it's a process of self-discovery. It's a process of kind of searching for an artistic muse, all of that kind of stuff. So on the surface, it seems like that was really one of those kind of traditional histories looking at, pleasure-seeking drug use. But along the way, I discovered that this was a club that was actually organized and directed by an asylum doctor. So Dr. Jacques-Joseph Moreau de Tours, he worked at the asylums in Paris, and he was really a firm advocate of self-experimentation as a research methodology. So what initially began as a kind of traditional narrative of pleasure-seeking drug use then has this medical connection. And so he viewed this as very important research because he was hoping to try and use hashish to cure madness. That was his goal. And he reasoned that if you can produce a kind of temporary state of madness within a sane person using hashish, you might be able to kind of use that same substance to coax a mental patient back to a state of reason or something. This was his thought, right?
You never know.
Right. You never know. It might work. So he was really committed to this research. So it was sort of a kind of an exercise in scientific experimentation and research, but also artistic self-discovery and pleasure-seeking. It was kind of all merged together. And when I continued digging, I found just so much in the medical journals and the medical archives written on drugs. So doctors were writing a lot on drugs in the 19th century. Well, when I look at the secondary literature on drugs, most of the discussion is about the rise of drugs as a social crisis, right? In the context of late 19th century debates on degeneration and things like that. And then, of course, with a view to the regulation of drugs by the state and kind of the demonization of addiction and things like that. But addiction is only really part of this story. So I was really primarily interested in figuring out how drugs became so normal and so widely consumed in the first place. And I think privileging addiction or privileging just the drugs associated with kind of addiction or the war on drugs kind of overlooks how drugs were woven into the fabric of everyday life. Because most addicts, or rather most users in the 19th century were not addicts. They didn't become addicted to the drugs they used. And even many addicts did not become addicts because of kind of all of the stigmatized reasons associated with kind of biases surrounding addiction, right? It wasn't necessarily pleasure-seeking. In fact, many, if not most addicts, encounter drugs firstly in the context of medicine. So I think taking this broader approach, addiction becomes one experience of consumption among many experiences. And it's all part of this new kind of normalization of the chemical enhancement of modern life, both, for the better and possibly for the worse, depending on your individual experience. And I think this really echoes the modern prescription opioid crisis. Now, of course, this is less severe in France than in the US, but there's still been a considerable uptick over the last few decades in the consumption and overconsumption of opiates, particularly. And I think oftentimes in modern society, too, we have this assumption that addiction is a product of back alley drug deals or nefarious activities or things like that. But I think the prescription opioid crisis has very much demonstrated that it's also part of the medical and pharmaceutical establishment. So despite claims that medical supervision was the way that, patients could use these substances safely, right? This was the narrative that doctors had in the 19th century. It's a continued narrative today. Psychotropic, the kind of psychotropic action of these drugs really was difficult to contain or control or kind of use for specific means, right? So it kind of often overflowed the boundaries of what doctors wanted it to do. So by broadening the perspective and looking at drugs in society as a whole and not just addiction and deviance, I think this better helps us understand the role of drugs in society in the 19th century. But I think it also helps us destigmatize addiction as just one form of drug consumption in our current psychotropic society as well.
That's a really interesting kind of way of playing the past and present off of each other, and I think really useful. And I think I really was interested in the way that you do. I think it already does some of that work in the fact that you choose these, I think, 6 different drugs, and the way that not all of them are seen through this kind of deviant lens today. So I think that just even kind of helping us get outside of the way that how we think about drugs and what kind of piles we put them in, whether this is medical or not, I think helps kind of say like, okay, but these didn't actually always even exist in those same spaces, that these were, and we're coming back to some of the medical research about some of these drugs too. So
Sure.
there's so many interesting kind of interweavings that are happening.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I wanted to make sure to
century.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to make sure to look at these drugs, opium and cocaine and things like this with chloroform and ether, which are not really commonly associated as drugs of abuse in the 20th century, but they were used recreationally, or what we would have recognized as recreational. I mean, I don't see the same kind of distinct recreational medicinal binary in the 19th century. I think that is maybe not as accurate for that time period, but all of these substances were used to produce pleasure, and all of them were used in some capacity in medicine as well. So I think there's like questioning that kind of distinction is also, an important part of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to kind of continue on this question about kind of what it does to kind of focus on normalization rather than the kind of deviancy that's been the norm in the history of drugs, I think, comes from the fact that you're a historian of medicine. This is a history of medicine. The title itself is Mind-Altering Medicine in the Long 19th Century. And so I think that, you show really clearly that the kind of normalization of mind-altering medicine, and more specifically, the kind of normalization of psychotropic substances in relieving pain, leads to the question that these questions that really deeply destabilize the normal. If we want to see the normal, which we maybe don't, as this kind of 19th century, liberal subject that you've been talking about that has kind of free will, rationality, this is kind of at the same time, drugs are, altering consciousness in these really kind of problematic ways. Doctors are conducting, self-experimentation as the way to gain this kind of rational knowledge, where they are kind of going outside of what we might see as normal rationality. As you said, that the mind does not always necessarily have kind of power over the body, even when the mind belongs to like the most rational actors, quote unquote, in the 19th century, right? Very, many air and scare quotes. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of conflict that comes in between normalization, how you show it kind of shoring up medical power, modern selfhood, the right to a pain-free life for these kind of individual subjects that have this kind of, they have the right to that. And at the same time, these kind of deep disruptions caused to this model of modern selfhood, for pleasure, with drug use for pleasure, but also in these medical contexts, as you're showing. Doctors, again, with self-experimentation, patients seeking pain relief, and this kind of whether or not patients or doctors found themselves addicted to these substances.
Yeah. So to kind of take the example of self-experimentation. So self-experimentation was in the 19th century a very key strategy for knowledge production, right? Because it's very difficult to extrapolate from animal research or other means what a safe dose might be, because a safe dose of chloroform for a guinea pig is not going to be the same as a human. And so they did conduct some animal research, but doctors were really eager to try and experiment on themselves. They wanted that kind of authority of personal experience. And this was really, important because they could say with confidence, okay, I have consumed opium, I consumed ether, and I understand what its effects are on my body. Now, of course, it doesn't always, each substance doesn't always act on each individual body in the same way, which is another question entirely. But they were using self-experimentation to give themselves increased confidence and increased authority as medical professionals, in prescribing these drugs. But the very research that they conducted on themselves also ended up destabilizing or revealing the kind of inherent instability of their vision of themselves as bourgeois men of science, right? The unified, rational, feeling, thinking self. So free will was kind of at the heart of that issue. And so when members of the Academy of Sciences and the Academy of Medicine figured out that they could inhale ether to eliminate the pain of surgery by eliminating consciousness, they were really excited to try it. So all over Paris, you have medical students, you have doctors, you have veterinarians and dentists, everyone is all getting together and inhaling ether and then jabbing each other with scalpels or poking themselves with pins because they're so eager to understand how this works, right? And in the kind of emerging ideals of scientific experimentation at the time, there's this emerging notion of objectivity, right? That if you want to conduct an objective scientific experiment, you're trying to kind of remove the self as much as possible from that experiment. And so that's how you kind of achieve scientific virtue, through objectivity. But of course, all of this drug experimentation, they're kind of consuming the drugs, and then they're using their own minds and bodies as the experimental tools. And they're actually operating on their own consciousness to try and, test the effects of these things. So the very tool that you're using to try and kind of rationally, document the experiment and measure it and, experience it is also the thing that you're messing with at the same time. So you have people experimenting, like I wrote about Pierre-Nicolas Jardy, who's a professor of surgical pathology at the Faculty of Medicine. And he, reported inhaling ether, and he's all grandiose about how, he's struggling against the ether. He's not letting it, take control of his consciousness, but he's like kind of resisting the effect he's trying to study. And he notes that he didn't lose consciousness, but so many other people did. And, this is his, status as the kind of fortified man of science. But ultimately, so many people did lose consciousness, or in some cases, they kind of lost their minds temporarily. I mean, sometimes expectedly and sometimes unexpectedly, right? Moreau's hashish research, he was actively trying to produce a state of temporary insanity. So, in that research, but it kind of questions the kind of unified, rational, free-willing self, because you're using your free will to say, I am going to do this research and I'm doing this for science, and look at me, this kind of, proud and brave, courageous kind of man of science. And at the same time, the research reveals that, you're not as in control of everything as you want to. And so there's this real tension between trying to control things and not being able to control and losing control. And in fact, some of this, self-experimentation, people were actively trying to research the connections between the mind and the body. And so severing those connections with anesthesia or manipulating sensation with hashish, they're trying to figure out how the self works. And so in doing this, they kind of expose how interconnected the mind and the body actually are in practice. And they feel really vulnerable about that. So self-experimentation is really key to the development of knowledge about drugs, and the kind of, which in turn kind of contributes to this larger normalization of drug use. But it also causes these men of science to really question the foundations of their existence, right? The rational, free-willing self that they think they are, and appreciate just how embodied selfhood is.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I remember especially liking, I think you quote Balzac being kind of like, I did hashish one time and of course it would have no effect on me. Like I'm too strong-willed.
Yeah, he said my brain was too strong. And then he acknowledged, he was like, this was his public claim. And then he acknowledged in a letter to Madame Hanska, I believe his future wife, he was like, I did try it and I actually experienced all of this kind of trippy stuff. It was like, but he was not willing to acknowledge it openly, which is very interesting given he was, such a user of coffee and, the kind of, caffeine didn't seem to be a problem, but hashish seemed to kind of undermine his selfhood in some ways.
Right. Yeah, right. One is like helping him do all of his rational work.
Right.
The other is kind of, yeah. No, so I think that actually ties in interesting ways to my next question, which is about kind of the fact that, you're not necessarily marketing your book as a book that's about gender and sexuality. At least it's not in the title. And yet I think that both play a really important role throughout the book. And I think that, this is there in the early chapters, which I think that this idea of the rational self that we've been talking about is in a lot of ways a gendered discussion. I think it kind of gives an interesting pendant to Jesse Hewitt's work in institutionalizing gender on this kind of problem of men's madness, which I think does kind of come up in some of these questions about the asylum that are in one of your chapters. Then in later chapters, maybe it becomes even more obvious through questions of kind of gendered and sexualized ideas and practices of drug use. And I was especially interested in the way that the chapter Sex and Drugs serves as a kind of outlier of sorts within the book, because it moves kind of the most fully of any of the chapters outside of the scope of medical or medico-legal history and this kind of medical normalization of drugs that's at the heart of the book, to talk about a really different kind of normalization. One that you are looking at mostly in the police archives, and that I think fits within like what we might think about as like kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll,
Sure.
much more than the kind of question of trying to cure pain, which I think when we think about psychotropic drugs and this kind of mind-altering medicine, we're not usually just thinking about pain, although I think that you show that that's a really important kind of point of entry into kind of drug use in the 19th century. So I'm wondering kind of how you see this chapter and kind of gender and sexuality more broadly within the book, both in and outside of medical discourse, as part of the larger scope of your book's argument. Is it doing something different for you? Is it kind of adding something? And kind of how you see gender and sexuality as caught up in these kind of differentiations between normal and deviant drug use that I think you're saying maybe isn't so much of a 19th century concern, although I think in the chapter on sex and drugs, we go into the 20th century a little bit more, and that maybe that becomes something that's more salient.
Yeah, so chapter 4 is a bit of an outlier chapter because it does focus on these consumers who are using drugs and turning to drugs to enhance their sexual pleasure. So the other chapters tend to focus on medical normalization, but here we have average citizens consuming drugs to enhance sex outside of medical control. So I think it's an important counterpoint because I think it illustrates, that the kind of chemical enhancement of everyday life, this new kind of norm in the psychotropic society I'm describing, is not just a top-down process. And it doesn't always happen in ways that doctors would approve of or encourage at the time. And so the chapter really looks at, how users explored the pleasurable aspects of drugs, and particularly the intersections of drugs and sex and their consumption together. So in the 19th century, and even before that, opium had long had a reputation as an aphrodisiac. Whether or not that's founded or not, it had a kind of popular reputation for that. So the chapter explores people who consumed opium and sex together in opium dens in Brest, Toulon, and Marseille, run by demi-mondains in those areas, and Montmartre prostitutes who offered cocaine and morphine and sex as a kind of common menu of items of pleasure or services on offer for their clients. So I think doctors just had a really profound discomfort with the kind of mutually reinforcing pleasures of sex and drugs. And the backdrop of this chapter is the degeneration and depopulation debates of the late 19th century, the concerns over the quality and the quantity of the population. And so doctors and social reformers are really concerned about sexual deviance and diverting sexual energies away from reproduction. And when I was researching this chapter, I was really surprised at this chapter, again, came from me being really surprised at how much doctors were writing about sex and drugs. And so medical research on drugs was actually quite extensive too. So the chapter, talks about the kind of popular conceptions of sex and drugs as these mutually reinforcing pleasures, but it also talks about, medical research on sex and drugs and actually how drugs influence the sexual apparatus of the human body. So, for example, when doctors heard that opium had this reputation as an aphrodisiac, they wanted to research it. So they explicitly designed experiments to try and research this. I actually found one medical medical thesis, and it was written by a medical student who smoked opium and then tested his body's physiological responses under its influence. So he was trying to test what would happen to his sexual desire, his sexual arousal, his ability to achieve an erection while smoking opium. I mean, graduate school was never so fun. But so he found, in low doses, he was stimulated. He found all of this kind of, desire and arousal. But, in these really high doses, he had really a difficult time achieving an erection. So doctors were actually very eager to kind of study the mechanisms of sex within the body as well. And so they were really also concerned about people's reproductive capacity in the context of this degeneration debate and the concerns about the quality and quantity of the population. So they were concerned about the impact of drug use and particularly drug addiction, morphine addiction in particular, on the reproductive capacity of both men and women. But interestingly enough, they were more concerned about men, which is refreshing in the degeneration debates. But they were concerned about they were concerned about the impact of morphine addiction on men's virility and the kind of impact of addiction on the quality of the sperm that they were seeing. Doctors were really just uncomfortable with this idea of drug consumption outside of the context of medical supervision. And so, when they actually prescribed drugs as a sexual aid, because they did do this in certain circumstances, they prescribed cocaine washes, kind of localized cocaine washes, to women who were suffering from vaginismus, which is a condition where sexual penetration is either prohibitively painful or impossible. So the goal in kind of prescribing the cocaine wash was not to enhance women's pleasure, but rather to kind of treat pathological pain to facilitate kind of penetrative reproductive sex. It's really kind of illustrating this double standard of pleasure there for men and women, because of course, these women's husbands have not been, denied their right to pleasure. They're continuing to have sex, as usual. But the women are basically anesthetized for the experience. So they're not feeling anything. And women actually complained about this. They said, I didn't want to just not feel pain. I actually wanted to experience pleasure. I experience pleasure in dreams. Why can't I do this in person? And so doctors didn't really take their concerns seriously. So I think doctors viewed kind of normal drug use as drug use under their own supervision and kind of demonized sex and drugs for pleasure. But individual consumption of these substances really kind of undermined their role as gatekeepers of drugs, and individuals really contributed a lot to determining, how and when they wanted to use these substances. And so I see this as kind of part and parcel of this larger normalization of the kind of chemical enhancement of modern life. Sometimes it's for medical purposes, sometimes it's for personal reasons, but it's kind of, expanding, in individuals' lives in many different ways.
Yeah, no, I think that its outlier status really did allow you to kind of get into this other realm. And it's interesting the way that it's like the police archive that allows you a little bit more access to that than in some other contexts. So it's like, I'm sure that this has, wider spread import, but that this is the space that's visible.
Well, yeah. And I mean, it's actually remarkably difficult to research drugs in the archives because there's no kind of clear set, like this is the file on drugs. So in the chapter where I talk about like criminal court cases, I had to like go through the Gazette des Tribunaux and trying to find things that mentioned drug use. And the police archives, fortunately they had, the National Archives has this huge archive of police, investigations into opium dens and concerns about sex and morality and reproduction and all of these things. So they really got invested in trying to kind of research these things.
Yeah, no, incredibly interesting. And I think that, what you were saying, I don't want to take up too much more time, even though I have a ton more questions. I want to get to the many questions that are in the chat, but I do think that, what you're saying here about kind of like pain versus pleasure, that it's like they're willing to, help women through their pain when it's, impeding intercourse, baby making, but that they don't care about the pleasure. And I think that, your last chapter in particular, which I'd love to have you talk more about, maybe if we have a little more time, but kind of looking at the way that, men's pain on the battlefield, we've got to deal with that. Women's pain in the birthing chamber, not so concerned about that. Maybe women are supposed to feel pain. So I think that there are all of these kind of gendered, interesting ways that, where pain is of concern to the nation, and where it's very much not. Is interesting. Okay, but so
sure.
to look into the chat, we have a fun fact from Seema Godfrey that the Club des Hachichans was located in the Hôtel Pimodon on the Ile Saint-Louis, which that now is the Hôtel Lauzon, which now serves as the Institut des Études Avancées. Don't know if they're still, doing the club's traditions. Maybe.
Not as far as I know. I have actually gone through the building. There was a special tour on when I was a graduate student. I don't know why they were doing a tour, but I was able to go through and look at the rooms and things. And yeah, it's pretty neat. So I don't know how one gets an invite to that. I actually don't even remember how it came about, but I was able to go and see it.
Very cool. Judy Coffin is wondering if she's right in thinking that psychological disorders and pain were considered more or less the same. Which kinds of pain were considered most important?
So, in terms of, these drugs were used in both contexts. I don't know that they necessarily I don't know that they necessarily viewed pain as a psychological disorder, or that all psychological disorders involve discomfort, but they were very much using these substances to treat kind of everyday pain. So there was all, I look at pharmaceutical manuals and kind of individual pharmaceutical recipe books and things like that to see kind of how people popularly used these substances themselves, in family pharmacy and things like that. But in the asylums, they were very much interested in trying to treat mental illnesses of various types with drugs. And they used hashish, which was ultimately not found to be very successful by Moreau. He tried really hard. He administered a lot of hashish to a lot of mental patients, but he didn't have the most promising results. But morphine in particular was very prominently used. So they tried to use it to treat hysteria. They tried to use it to treat mania without delirium, all of these different kinds of conditions, and they used incredibly high doses to try and treat these patients. So it's possible that they were just drugging the patients enough to kind of subdue them so that they seemed supposedly normal, and then this was kind of producing the miracle cures that they found. But they also extensively used morphine in the asylums in Bicêtre and Salpêtrière as a kind of instrument of social control. So, people once the kind of morphine addiction became more widely viewed as a problem in the, in emerging social and medical discourses of the 1880s, really is when they're viewing addiction as a major social crisis. People were saying, well, part of the problem is that in the asylum wards, you have, nurses and doctors going around and just for the night shift, they're just administering morphine to everyone. So they'll keep quiet and they won't have an annoying shift. Right. So there's a way in which it's used as an instrument of social control as well. But I'm sure the relief of pain with these drugs also may have contributed to those dynamics as well for mental patients.
Judy was also wondering if you have any thoughts about the documentary on the Sacklers.
I don't have any strong thoughts yet. It's still on my list of things to watch because I had a baby last year and I haven't watched anything in a long, long time. So, yes, I think I imagine it focused on the kind of nefarious pharmaceutical companies trying to market things as inherently, safer than other drugs. And I think that a lot of people have made those claims. There were claims to try and, okay, so we have this problem from morphine addiction. How can we treat this? And doctors said, okay, well, let's use cocaine. And they tried to use cocaine to treat morphine addiction. And then you have double addictions going on, or they thought heroin was safer than morphine. And it turns out not so much. Yeah, heroin was initially introduced as a children's cough suppressant. Thank you, Bayer Company. So I think that it's very easy to try and claim that you can control these substances, but I think the substances acting on the mind and the body, it's very difficult to kind of anticipate how they're going to respond or how they're going to kind of alter the physiological equilibrium of, the human organism, which creates issues of addiction and others.
Thanks. Another question from Gavin Murray Miller. Hi, Sarah. I am curious to what extent this normalization was a pan-European phenomenon. Were there international bodies / conferences / scholarly gatherings on questions over pain management and the medical uses of these substances? Your book does draw upon sources from Germany, Britain, and the United States, but do you see consumption and drug production as a particularly French story? How does this relate to what other countries at the time are doing? What was the same and what was different?
So that's a big question. So France is unique in some ways because of its kind of clinical medicine in the 19th century. It was very much, particularly in the early 19th century, this kind of center for the production of medical knowledge. So I think a lot of the research on drugs and the self-experimentation is happening in France. But I don't see psychotropic society as something that is solely a French phenomenon. I think the Germans were doing a lot of research as well. And a lot of the initial morphine research was, done by German doctors. And similarly, ether research was very much an American phenomenon first. It stemmed from ether frolics, people going and enjoying ether and kind of, for pleasure, and then tripping and, realizing, oh, I've hurt myself, but it doesn't actually hurt. Like, how can we use this for medicine? So it is very much an international story. But I think that there's something specific about the kind of medical research, the huge volume of production of research on drugs in France. But of course, pharmaceutical industrialization is happening elsewhere as well. And then France is, it's got regulations on drugs in the 19th century, but the regulations are very different than the kinds of regulations you see emerging later in the US and Britain in the later 19th, early 20th century that focus on drugs as kind of illegal substances to consume versus, the French regulations were, it was the poisonous substances legislation of the 1840s. And so it was basically looking at drugs as poisons. So they regulated the sale of the drugs, not the consumption of the drugs, which was not illegal. But they regulated the sale and they kind of limited that to a prescription from a physician, and a pharmacist kind of executing that prescription. But they regulated them alongside things like strychnine and arsenic. So this kind of formalized French discussions about drugs early on, but in a way that wasn't specific to kind of the demonization of addiction and the social crisis that came later. So that may also have contributed to the large volume of French research on drugs. But I see similar phenomenon in Britain and France. Britain and Germany and the US. I wouldn't claim to be an expert in any of those contexts by any means, but you see a similar kind of increase in psychotropic consumption in this time.
Well, we also had a very kind offer from Alyssa Seppenwall, who, if you would like to offer a kind of appreciation of the book as a member of the committee, that would be really fantastic.
Sure, if if we can make that happen. I don't have control over the tech aspect.
I
Hi,
think we've made
Sarah.
it
How are
happen.
you?
Hi, I'm fine. How are you?
Good. It's nice to meet you. So I just wanted to share. So I was on the Russell Major Prize Committee, and I won't be in San Francisco. So I just wanted to share some appreciation. And I think we have a 75-word citation, but I think that's not enough to really show appreciation for your book. So I just wanted to say first, it's so beautifully written.
Thank you.
Just from the first line, right? I'll open it here so I don't misremember. From the first line, in the 19th century, France was a nation on drugs. I mean, it just is so beautifully written. I saw there was just so much craft in here in the writing, and you as a
Thank you.
storyteller. And as Hannah said, every chapter is telling a different story. It's not repetitive, and you're also deploying so many different kinds of histories. Like, watch me do intellectual history of science. Now watch me do consumer culture. And I thought that that was extremely impressive. And as Hannah said, you also have gender and class and colonialism in here and thinking about where the drugs come from. The book is also funny. I just thought
Thank
that
you.
you were a great storyteller. I just picked this one sentence to highlight from page 79 about one of your doctors experimenting on himself. In a prolonged state of ether-induced delirium, Sophie felt himself, quote, irresistibly drawn, end quote, to waltz around the room with an armchair as his dancing partner. It just, I thought that you were, again, really using so many different kinds of sources. And as you said, reading them against the grain to understand consumers being interested in these drugs and asking their doctors for them, even without commercials.
Right. It's
On
possible.
TV. Yeah. So it just seemed to me it's an interesting commodity history of empire also. And I just thought, even though I'm not a history of medicine, it does so many interesting things that help explain how the world is today, and especially when you connect it with OxyContin in the end. So I just wanted to thank you and congratulate you, Sarah.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I really appreciate you reading the book. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, if there is like one last really quick question or comment, I'm happy to take it. Otherwise, we are just about out of time. So I hope that you'll all join me in thanking Sarah and congratulating her on this prize-winning book that I hope you will all have a chance to read. If I've understood correctly, that we could stick around and chat a little if anybody wants to do that, but otherwise, I hope that everybody has a really wonderful rest of your Sunday and enjoy the extra hour that we all got today, at least in the US.
Thank you guys so much. And thank you again, Hannah, for your comments and for your questions.
It was truly very fun to get to read your book. I agree with Alyssa.
Well, thank you. It was fun to write it.